third installment of the online Olio webinar series for fall of 2020. And we are going to be, excuse me. Oh, that's not working. Okay. We are going to be talking today about education accessibility and Margaret Cavendish in the classroom. And today's panelists will be Liza Blake, Sarah Connell, and myself, E Spencer. And I want to give a special thank you to James Fitzmaurice, who's agreed to be a moderator for us today in our breakout room, as well as my co-organizers, Sophia Richardson, who'll be watching our chat, and Arno Zimmern, who will be our visual moderator. Now, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what we'll be doing today, this is our timeline. So I'm giving you your introduction now. I will begin the panel and then followed by Sarah Connell and Liza Blake. After that, we're gonna have a 5-minute bio break or coffee break. And then we're gonna break into breakout rooms of about 10 or 12 folks. And we're hoping that this will give you a chance to talk with one of the panelists one-on-one, but also to bring up ideas that were brought up in other papers and in the pre-readings, and just sort of get the conversation flowing in sort of a nice, intimate setting. Then we're going to bring it all back together and have a large group discussion. Based on the last couple of weeks, these have been really robust, very, very interesting. And then at the end, we are going to have just a brief wrap up. We're hoping to have another second series of webinars in the spring. And to that end, we will be asking you to do just a brief evaluation of your experience with these events that will hopefully help give us a sense of how to move forward and improve on this sort of experimental process. It'll also give you an opportunity to volunteer if you would like to participate or organize a panel in the future. So to go ahead and get us started, just about myself, you can call me E or Mariah. I'm a doctoral candidate, so this is still all a little bit new to me. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar finishing up my PhD in English at the University of Iowa. I've experience as a licensed secondary teacher and have previously studied the long history of science fiction. My current research combines the study of feminist literary theory, book and reception history, and pedagogy in order to assist in the ongoing reclamation process for early women writers. My dissertation, entitled Teaching Early Women Writers, Margaret Cavendish and the Problem of Female Authorship, draws on Cavendish as a case study for expanding representation of and access to early women writers, both in and out of the classroom. My paper that I'll be giving today draws both on my research for my dissertation as well as a forthcoming article in the History of Education Quarterly that looks at Margaret Cavendish's personal educational experiences as well as some of her developing pedagogical theories. So to begin, a child's brain is like an island uninhabited, and the blood in the veins is the sea that doth surround it. But time, the great navigator, plants it with strength, which causeth the spirits as merchants to traffic thereto, by which it becomes populated with thoughts and builds towers of imaginations. In this obscure passage, tucked away at the end of a long list of allegories in the world's Olio, Cavendish shows her long and abiding interest in theories of the mind. Here, she uses one of her favorite literary techniques, the simile, to compare a child's brain to an uninhabited island, and likens its development over time with merchants navigating the sea. In other places, she compares the mind to a house being built. In both cases, the child needs the assistance of education to develop its full potential. As the child learns, their mind's island becomes populated with thoughts, imaginations, opinions, fancies, and wit. Prior to education and experience, Cavendish also writes, quote, "A child's brain is like a ground uncultivated," end quote. She considers time a husbandman who must sow the seeds of thought and portrays the empty, raw, unsown nature of the mind prior to experience. She also identifies the unique nature of individual minds, with some being naturally barren while others are more fertile, but want the manuring of education in order to be productive. Cavendish repeats this simile in the She Anchoret, once again acknowledging the natural differences that exist amongst individuals, while underscoring the developmental value of educating the young. For, as Lisa Walters notes, quote, Cavendish suggests that human children are born with reason, but their minds slowly develop to ascertain knowledge that is necessary for their species or type. end quote. In these and many other texts, Cavendish explores theories of the mind, learning, and education. Last week, Sophia Richardson described Cavendish's habit of offering up tiny morsels on a given subject, rather than hefty treatises. This excellent metaphor stands true for her pedagogical theories as well. So, while Cavendish did not publish any treatises on her educational theories, as Anna Maria von Scherman or Bathsua Macon did, she still addressed such ideas repeatedly and persistently throughout her corpus. By sifting through her numerous paratextual materials, prose fiction, and philosophical writings, not to mention her experimental poetry and plays, my research revisions Cavendish, to use Adrienne Rich's term, as a feminist pedagogue whose educational theories can be used to great effect in the modern classroom. It's important to note that Cavendish never refers to herself as a pedagogue and is often quite critical of pedants and pedantry. However, as Marina Leslie said at the 2019 Margaret Cavendish Society conference in Norway, quote, Cavendish would directly or indirectly be exposed to nearly every form of education recognized as such in the period, end quote. Cavendish used this exposure to form her own pedagogical theories and repeatedly explores them throughout her many works. I'm especially interested in Cavendish's advocacy of women's education, her repeated exploration and description of metacognitive practices, her use of symbolic models to teach through her texts, and her belief that learning should be fun and that teachers should be kind. Today, I will briefly focus on her advocacy of women's education, a tiny sample of which has been provided in the pre-circulated readings for this session, and the prescient way that she uses symbolic models in her fiction to teach through her texts. In the preface to the reader in the World's Olio, Cavendish appears to seriously criticize her sex, describing women as bees that might sting men to death, for example. Shout out to my insect lovers here. Even as she acknowledges the fact that men held the literal and the metaphorical keys to knowledge. She recommends that aristocratic women use their idle time to read and contemplate on their own, suggesting that women might circumvent many imposed barriers in this way. Cavendish writes, quote, women can have no excuse or complaints of being subjects as a hindrance from thinking, for thoughts are free. Those can never be enslaved. For we are not hindered from studying, since we are allowed so much idle time that we know not how to pass it away, but may as well read in our closets as men in their colleges, end quote. Here I read Cavendish as particularly subversive, suggesting a sort of cognitive revolution in which women break free of male-imposed barriers from within their minds. She explains that women can achieve their own form of education by using their idle time to read and contemplate on their own. The telling juxtaposition of closets and colleges suggests why Cavendish went on to advocate for women's education as boldly and persistently as she did. Women were systematically excluded and oppressed, despite the fact that they were as capable of education and learning as men. Rather than reading this preface as an invective against women, or as a strictly ironic rhetorical gesture, I see it instead as the beginning of a well-reasoned and lifelong argument for women's education. Though underwhelming by modern standards, Cavendish was still subversive when she concludes, quote, so women by education may come to be far more knowing and learned than some rustic and rude-bred men, end quote. Cavendish again uses juxtaposition to great effect, showing the extent of gendered inequality through the comparison of knowing and learned women to rustic and rude men. She qualifies this statement even further with the use of the word some, the implication being that many rustic and rudely bred men remained superior to the best bred and educated women. Cavendish goes on in later publications, however, to make her argument for women's education more explicit. For example, in Sociable Letters, Cavendish writes, quote, women are not educated as they should be. I mean, those of quality, for their education is only to dance, sing, and fiddle, end quote. I read this passage in two ways. One, it reinforces the idea that aristocratic women, those of quality, deserve an education. And two, it acknowledges the disparity that existed between aristocratic women and those of the lower classes, many of whom, though largely illiterate, worked and held professional positions. Furthermore, Cavendish's focus on the education of the body underscores an enduring contemporaneous belief that women's education was ornamental, or even entertaining. When women were seriously educated, as portrayed in The Contract or The Female Academy, for example, it was often so they could better serve their husbands. The rudiments of reading and writing allowed genteel women to more efficiently run their households, serve as secretaries to their husbands, and keep in touch with friends and family through correspondence. Cavendish's juxtaposition of the body a courtier and the mind a clown recalls what she had written 9 years earlier about women being treated like children, fools, or subjects. Her sustained criticism of gender inequality was likely why Basuah-Macon included Cavendish in her essay on women's educational reform. The fact that Macon desired a broad humanist curriculum for her women's school, based on the work of John Amos Comenius and Mark Lewis, but was forced instead to focus on the usual attainments of music and dancing, testifies to the enduring oppression early modern women faced. Cavendish argued that women could and should be more intellectual, despite the oppression and the barriers that they faced. In Poems and Fancies, she tries to spur other aristocratic women into action when she writes, "And though we be inferior to men, let us show ourselves a degree above beasts, and not eat and drink and sleep away our time as they do, and live only to the sense, not to the reason, and so turn into forgotten dust." Cavendish urges women to take education into their own hands, to read, think, and write for their posterity. Here and in other places throughout her corpus, Cavendish warns women against idleness. For, as Comenius wrote, quote, "The more we occupy their thoughts, so much the less will the folly that arises from emptiness of mind find a place," end quote. Yet Cavendish believed that even wild minds could be civilized by education, and suggested that doing so would benefit the whole of society. She writes, quote, "Those women are best bred, whose minds are civilest as being well taught and governed, for the mind will be wild and barbarous unless it is enclosed with study, instructed by learning, and governed by knowledge and understanding," end quote. Having experienced and personally suffered from the ravages of the English Civil War, Cavendish advocated for peace and stability. She believed, as did Comenius and Anna Maria von Sherman before her, and John Locke and Macon after her, that expanding the humanist tradition to include the education of more women would greatly benefit society. In addition to advocating for women's education, Cavendish tries to teach alternatives to traditional femininity by repeatedly providing readers with symbolic models of competent and educated women. She does this throughout her corpus, but today I would like to focus on one of her lesser known or lesser discussed texts, a short romance from Nature's Pictures titled The Contract. Contrary to the autobiographical reading of this story offered by Kate Lilly, I view this compact little story as a remarkably cogent example of Cavendish's early feminist pedagogy. As noted elsewhere, The Contract is one of Cavendish's many works that explores the myriad ways in which to develop the capacities and abilities of individuals to their fullest. As noted in the pre-readings, this short story follows the education and training of the young lady Delicia, who was promised in marriage to the son of a great duke. When the son breaks his promise, Delicia's uncle strives to make her wise, so that she will be a more desirable mate. Cavendish carefully describes the girl's curriculum and at least 2 pedagogical strategies that the uncle uses. Beginning at the age of 7, Delicia's uncle gives her books of moral philosophy to lay a ground and foundation of virtue, history to learn her experience by the second hand, and the best poets to delight in their fancies and recreate in their wit. In addition to having Delicia recite poetry at the end of each night, her uncle also taught her to understand what she read by explaining to her the meaning of hard or obscure passages. Here, Cavendish builds on the humanist insistence that virtue lay at the core of any educational endeavor, while also explicitly asserting that learning can take place through symbolic models. Refusing to let his niece read romances while offering her history books so that she can learn her experience by the second hand, Delicia's uncle opens up an avenue of knowledge previously closed to women, while his explanation of obscure passages prepares her for the next stage of her educational journey. Perhaps drawing on the life of the Dutch pedagogue von Sherman, who was one of the first to explicitly state that a maid may be a scholar, Cavendish sends Lady Delicia and her uncle to the city to study at university. Like von Sherman, who attended the University of Utrecht while sitting, quote, behind a curtain in her classes lest she distract her male peers, end quote, Lady Delisha spends 2 years attending lectures on natural philosophy, physics, chemistry, and the law, while heavily veiled to assure anonymity. With this rigorous education, Delisha gains a strong sense of self, proclaiming, quote, "I can look at the world in the face with a confident brow," end quote. In this way, an education that was designed to attract a husband also lends Lady Delisha subjectivity and agency. For she asks her uncle, quote, "Who are happier than those that are mistresses of their own fortunes?" End quote. Following her own judgment, Delisha then proceeds to gain the love of the man to whom she had originally been promised. After a series of mysterious appearances at court, the young Duke acknowledges his affection for Delisha when he tells her, "You cannot be comprehended." No longer falling within the accepted parameters of the traditional male-female binary, Delisha's incomprehensibility as a complex woman who demonstrates intelligence, competence, and agency only increases as the story progresses. For, not only does she gain the Duke's love, she also pleads her case in court, ultimately convincing the judges to rule the Duke's marriage to the widow illegitimate. In a scene tantalizingly reminiscent of Portia's outwitting of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, Lady Delisha uses her masculine education to control her own destiny and gain the affection of the man she loves. In this way, Cavendish explores the extraordinary potential of women's education and uses her fiction to show women an alternative to traditional femininity. Focusing on childhood, Walter summarizes Cavendish's position on girls' education when she writes, quote, "Girls' education should not focus upon obedience and chastity, but instead should be as rigorous and imaginative as possible to prevent women from, quote, growing irrational as idiots," end quote. Furthermore, by repeatedly teaching this lesson of woman's true potential in her fiction, Cavendish does precisely what David Cunning and Mara Smith have suggested regarding her use of fancy in fictional world building. Smith writes, quote, "Cavendish ultimately theorizes fancy as a tool that allows women to imagine alternate fictional worlds better suited for them," end quote. This tool, like the teaching of history, allows her readers to learn their experience by the second hand, and to imagine new and expanded roles for themselves in the real world. Furthermore, as Cunning explains, quote, "Cavendish accordingly uses her fiction to shine a light on the sinews and joints of our own world, and the different kinds of scaffolding that it provides to some, but not to others," end quote. In this way, Cavendish teaches her readers to see their worlds critically, while imagining improved alternatives. Now, I'd like to end today with a further meditation on Smith's work because of the way in which she links Cavendish's early fiction to that of the women who follow shortly after her. Smith writes of Aphra Behn, Eliza Haywood, and Della Riviere Manley as having taken Cavendish's lesson on female fancy, taught through symbolic models in her texts, to heart. Smith writes, quote, "For it is Cavendish who releases fancy from its early modern mindscape, where predominantly men try to fix it in place, and lets it loose in the world where women can put it to use," end quote. Having released fancy from its mental prison and given it the power to reveal intellectual and creative freedom for women, Smith suggests Cavendish's writing doesn't suffocate other women writers, as Virginia Woolf might have us believe. Instead, it, quote, "was her writing that cleared a path for them, especially for women who wrote during a time when patriarchal structures suffocated their minds," end quote. Yet even as the field of feminist literary history and the record of early women writers continues to expand, access to these women and their writings often remains limited to those who already know where to look. And we can't teach what we don't know. For this reason, I will now turn to my co-panelists for information on accessibility to and the teaching of early modern women writers. Thank you. All right, everybody. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move to Sarah Connell. And before I stop screen sharing, I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction. I have listed here just a few of her recent or forthcoming publications. Sarah Connell is the Assistant Director of the Women Writers Project and the NU Lab for Text, Maps, and Networks at Northeastern University. Her research focuses on text encoding and computational text analysis, medieval and early modern historiography, and pedagogies of digital scholarship. Her current projects include a text encoding and analysis project on early modern narratives of national identity and an NEH-funded seminar series on research and teaching with word embedding models. Within her capacity as Assistant Director of the WWP, Sarah Connell also coordinates and teaches digital workshops on a number of topics, including text encoding, TEI customization, developing digital projects, topic modeling, vector space modeling, and text analysis. And now I will stop sharing my screen and Sarah can take over.
All right. Is that working? Everyone can see my screen? All right, brilliant. Great, so I wanted to start by thanking all of the organizers for the amazing work that you did in pulling these events together. It's been really wonderful to be part of these discussions, especially these days. And I've been really glad to kind of connect with the Cavendish community. And so I'm also thanking everyone who's here as well. It's wonderful to have you all here. What better way could you spend a Friday afternoon? So I'd like to begin with a quote from one of the prefatory paratexts in Cavendish's Observations upon Experimental Philosophy. Cavendish speaks of her difficulties with the hard words that she had encountered in other authors' philosophical works, and describes an approach in which she has come to understand some of those words by explanation, and others by what would have been called context clues when I was in elementary school. That is, she seeks out the context and the connection of the sense. I liked that phrasing, context and connection, so much that I stole it for my title, because it really speaks to the main goals of the work that I do in text encoding, both as part of my research and in the classroom. And so I'll be talking today about the Women Writers Online Collection, which contains many works by Cavendish, and about how we at the Women Writers Project have been working to bring both early modern women's texts and text encoding into graduate and undergrad classrooms. So much as Cavendish critiques the difficulties posed by unexplained hard words, we in teaching digital technologies for humanities classrooms need to introduce technical concepts in ways that will avoid the alienating experience that she describes and instead be closely contextualized with the goals of the class. So I'll be sharing some of the approaches that we've developed to hopefully instruct our students more than we obstruct them when we ask them not only to conduct research with encoded texts, but also to take on the roles of textual editors themselves. Taking Cavendish to heart, I'm going to start with some core concepts. We use the Text Encoding Initiative markup language to create digital models of humanities documents. The essential activity of encoding is naming and marking the boundaries of textual features. We use what are called elements to say things like, this is the name of a person, and it starts here and it ends here. So you're looking now at a few purse name elements, each of which has a start tag and an end tag, that's the text in blue. And these elements then have contents, which is in this case various versions of Margaret and William Cavendish's names. In addition to elements, you also have attributes, which provide more information about elements. And that's the text you're seeing in orange and brown. In this case, we have the ref attribute pointing to the entries for Margaret and William to establish without any ambiguity that these are the people being referenced, even when their names are differently spelled or even abbreviated. And that's basically it. We use these elements to mark out the textual features that we've selected for modeling, and we use attributes to layer additional information into our encoded texts. One outcome of this encoding is Women Writers Online, which contains about 430 texts written by or attributed to women, first published primarily in print and in English between 1526 and 1850. I've included the credentials that we also circulated beforehand for those who might not have access to WWO. These will stay live for about another month or longer if I forget to take them down, which honestly I probably will. We definitely don't want to exclude everybody from the WWO collection. So please, if you're interested in reaching out and getting involved, just email me and we can set up access. So it's important that WWO not only make these texts accessible, but also that it contextualizes them as a collection. You can read and search across hundreds of women's texts together, and the collection is also supplemented by contemporary reviews and short scholarly essays. So what you're looking at now is another paratext from Observations. This one is signed by William Cavendish, and if you had a chance to look at this in the readings, you know that there is actually a lot more detail available in the encoded version. Taking a look at that now. There we go. In fact, this is a simplified version of the markup for the TEI edition of this text. There are a few things to note here. First is that we're now seeing the broader context for the basic containment into elements that we were just looking at. So the purse name for William Newcastle at the bottom there is in a signature, which is in the closing matter for this textual division. And we can also see how attributes are providing more information about elements. For instance, we have this type attribute at the top there with that div, which is specifying that this type of textual division is a preface. And then we also have another type attribute on this LG for line group, specifying here that this is a poem and not, say, a song. You can also see that we're using an XML lang attribute to mark a shift in language, and we're drawing here on an international standardized list of language codes, which means that this information is computationally actionable. We're using the encoding to mark a shift not just in language, but also in authorship. So the author attribute on the div element indicates that this division was attributed to William Cavendish instead of Margaret. Just as we saw with that ref on purse name, this is pointing to the entry for William and what we call our personography. And finally, you can see some of the impacts of our editorial decisions and how these require exercising some judgment. For example, we're using a head or heading element to enclose the text, "To Her Grace, the Duchess of Newcastle, on her observations upon experimental philosophy." We could also have treated that more like a salutation in a letter, much as the piece is signed at the end, but we decided in this case that the language is functioning more like the heading of a division than it is operating as a salutation. Okay, so hopefully that makes the process of encoding a bit more concrete and shows some of the things that we need to be weighing when we mark text up. As I'm sure you can imagine, this is quite a lot of work, and most of it isn't even visible in the current version of the web interface. So why do we do this? First and foremost, it's because we believe that it is important to produce accurate textual models. And we know that the capabilities of web interfaces will change over the years. Remember, the Women Writers Project has been around for more than 30 years. For us, the essential thing is to be consistently representing those aspects of our documents that we have decided to formalize. But also, when you work directly in the markup, it supports some really powerful analyses. For example, markup allows us to be very precise in the language that we can extract for further examination. So we can distinguish between the language written by Margaret Cavendish and that attributed to William or to others, recognizing, of course, that this can be very complicated and noting that we at the WWP rely on the text's own attributions for making decisions about assigning authorship. We can also exclude things like indices, tables of contents, and so on, so we can have a great deal of control over the language that we extract and analyze. And we can do the same sort of thing focusing on prose or verse, language in English and Latin, and so on. We can also look at named entities, the various people, places, and other things named in works by Cavendish and others. And we can look at language shifts. Does Cavendish use Latin and French in ways that are similar to other 17th century writers? Finally, we can analyze the aspects of verse that are modeled in the encoding. For instance, the different types of verse, those elements contained within verse lines, how emphatic is verse in comparison to prose, and where verse appears within texts of different genres or from different time periods. Essentially, anything within the encoding can be a lever for analysis. These are just a few possibilities suggested by a single short selection from one text. When you scale up to all of the Cavendish texts in Women Writers Online, or even look across the whole WWO collection, the potential becomes very exciting. So this is the sort of analysis made possible by the work that goes into producing a TEI edition. And in fact, both of these axes can be really productive in the classroom. What can you do with information like this, and how do you produce such information in the first place? Now I'm going to turn to text encoding and analysis from a pedagogical perspective. I've done several different TEI projects and literature classes at Northeastern, including a few with Professor Marina Leslie, who I'm so delighted to see here today. The specifics for these have varied depending on the class context, but for most I've found that it works really well to break the students into project teams and ask them to make their editorial decisions collectively, then apply those decisions to documents or document selections of their own. This brings students into direct contact with a number of the interesting and often thorny issues that will be familiar to anyone who's ever edited early documents. The thing with TEI is that it does not allow you to be vague at all in how you're approaching your document. Editorial decisions are explicitly formalized in the encoding. So this means that students have clearly articulated editorial theories and a strong sense of how they're applying those theories to their specific texts. We ask the students to really inhabit the role of editors, and we emphasize that this is not about technical proficiency with the markup. Instead, it's about having a well-developed approach to editing their documents and thoughtfully deciding how to encode and publish those documents based on that approach. So here are just a few of the sorts of things that students need to make decisions about. Since TEI editions are models, not reproductions, student editors need to decide which features they want to select in their markup. That means they need a clear sense of what is significant enough to merit formalization. You can't encode everything, or you could try, but it would take forever. So you need to know what is important. Students also need to select which elements they will use for the features they want to formalize. Some are obvious, such as divs for major textual divisions, but in other cases, students can choose to select elements based on their desired levels of specificity and semantics. For example, some might want to distinguish between place names, person names, and organization names, or others might just want to encode all of those as names and leave it at that. Student editors can also use attributes to further describe their documents. For example, they can develop and apply taxonomies for different textual divisions and types of verse. Students also make decisions about linking both within and between documents and about how much computationally formalized information they want to layer in, such as we saw with adding language codes. They might create and link to personography entries, and they can also link to external sources and other relevant documents in digital collections, even things like Wikipedia. Regularization is a place where students can get very invested in implementing their own editorial theories. Typically, some will be deeply committed to providing modernized web reading editions, and others will be equally focused on preserving all of the information in their original documents. If you ever want to see a bunch of undergraduates get very, very passionate about the long S, this is where that's going to happen. Typically, students are also invested in decisions about representing the appearance of the original documents in their digital editions. You'll see different editorial approaches coming through clearly here as well. Some students will want to preserve every aspect of their text alignment, indentation, font size, and so on. Others might not care about much beyond italicization. And finally, the TEI has provisions for applying and describing editorial interventions, such as handling of unclear or missing text and alternate readings. I typically encourage students to add contextual annotations, and most of the assignments I've taught also make use of the TEI's provisions for interpretation and analysis. In these, you define different interpretive annotations and then apply them to selected segments of the text. For example, students might identify languages relating to animals or nature or politics or scientific inquiry or education. Essentially, we're asking students to come up with a consistent and thoughtful editorial framework based on their own carefully articulated project goals. And then, and I will admit that this is kind of a dirty trick, we ask them to apply these thoughtful, careful, detailed editorial decisions to actual early modern texts. Without exception, as soon as the rubber hits the road or the markup hits the text, there will immediately be edge cases, things the students hadn't anticipated, and what we at the WWP call, and this is the official term, general weirdness. Of course, that's the point of the whole exercise. I chose that word unruly very carefully. Early modern texts are simply resistant to editorial rules. And so this is where that project framing becomes very useful. First, because it lets the student see what is in fact distinctive about individual text and what is just a manifestation of early modern printing practices. And also because asking students to make these decisions collectively tends to engender healthy debates about what the goals and purposes of their digital editions really are. For example, one group from a class I taught got very invested in the physical conditions of their documents, and they developed a detailed provision for encoding various causes of gaps in unclear texts, and then a mechanism for displaying that information online. Another group decided on a feminist rereading of their documents, deliberately applying 21st century intersectional feminist values to read against the positive and negative associations of femininity and masculinity in their 17th century documents. This group approach also allows us to examine the student's text as a corpus. We can then do the sorts of analysis I was just describing, such as looking at names of persons or comparing the language of verse and prose. In particular, it's always interesting to look at collective information on the student's interpretive analyses. They can start to develop a better understanding of how, say, early modern scientific language functions by examining that manifestations of such language across their whole set of text. And they can also have really productive conversations about how they decided to apply their interpretations, since this is a place where editorial judgment is especially visible. Which leads me to my last point. In addition to having students learn to be digital scholarly editors, we can also teach them how to perform markup-based analyses, both across their own corpora and also in collections like Women Writers Online. For example, if you did have time to read through the prefatory materials from Observations, you might have noted informally that there are quite a few titles mentioned in that short selection, and they're all Cavendish's own works. With markup, we can move from observation to computational analysis. For example, looking at all of the different intertextual gestures in the WWO Cavendish texts. As I noted earlier, one particularly powerful aspect of encoding is the formalization of linked information systems. Here we can see that each of these title elements has a ref attribute. These point to a bibliography of all of the text named, quoted, or referenced in Women Writers Online. Markup like this allows us to be quite precise about observations like Cavendish frequently names her own titles. In fact, out of 201 titles named in our Cavendish texts, 94 are her own. Looking at the broader context for this sample, we might also note that the address to the reader is one of 6 prefatory addresses in Observations. Cavendish prefaces are sometimes described as excessive, and in fact, this is something else that we can show students how to systematically analyze with markup. Looking across the 428 texts in the WWO collection, 7 total texts have at least 6 prefatory divisions, and 3 of those 7 are by Cavendish. However, that's just one possible way that you might measure prefatory excess. And in fact, an essential aspect of teaching these methods in the classroom is helping students to think through the ramifications of their decisions as they navigate between research questions like how do Cavendish's prefaces function and the precision demanded by encoding-based queries. To wrap up, I just wanted to point out a few of the places where you might go if you were interested in doing any teaching with WWP resources. Everything on this slide is open access. And like I said, just email me if you want to teach with WWO itself and you don't have institutional access. The main thing here is our Teaching Partners program. This is where we collect examples from different classes using the WWP's publications. And if you think you might be interested in becoming a teaching partner yourself, please reach out to me. I would be so delighted to hear from you. And we also have reviews, scholarly essays, and a lab space with more experimental work. So I'm hoping that that was more instructive than obstructive, and I'd be happy to answer any questions during our discussions afterwards. Thank you very much.
So Liza Blake, these are, again, just a few of the publications that she has either recently put out or are forthcoming. Liza Blake is an associate professor of English and drama at the University of Toronto. Her research interests include medieval and Renaissance literature, including drama, poetry, and prose, dramatic literature and theater practices, poetics, literature and science, literature and philosophy, as well as the history of materialism. Her current or recent projects include maintaining a census of surviving Cavendish books for the digital Cavendish, which she co-directs with Sean Moore and Jacob Tutalian, and her scholarly editing of the digital critical edition of Poems and Fancies, which she will spend some time discussing today. Among her many upcoming publications, Liza Blake is currently working on an incredibly fascinating sounding multimedia monograph entitled Choose Your Own Poems and Fancies, Margaret Cavendish's Atom Poems. And now I will hand it over to you, Liza.
Thank you for asking me to unmute. I almost forgot that. That would have been super awkward. So I will just say today, I think that what I was supposed to cover was actually thinking about the process of creating the digital edition, the Poems and Fancies digital edition, which I had you all read today. But I've actually written about that process already through the Women Writers Online Teaching Partners program, Connell mentioned at the end of her presentation. So you can read about it there, and I'm happy to send the link, or I'm happy to talk about it more. But today for my time, I've actually gone a bit rogue, and I'm going to talk about access, audience, and editing. And most of my presentation today will be a reflection on ways of thinking about access, if I can get it to work. Okay, is Margaret Cavendish accessible? Who among us can't relate to the woman pictured here, installed behind a banister, surrounded by cherubs, wearing a crown? Or likewise, this woman standing on a pedestal in an ermine cloak suggestive of a toga. Who among us can't help but look at this image and say to themselves, yes, accessible, relatable. Kidding aside, I want to think with you today about what it means to access Cavendish or to have access to Cavendish. And I also want to think about how the answer to that question, to those questions, have changed over time. So here are the 4 questions I'm going to very quickly run through today. 1, who has access to Cavendish's writing now? 2, how did Cavendish understand and manage access to her text historically? 3, what are we accessing when we read Cavendish's text today? And 4, how can we think not only about access, but also about accessibility? So let's start with this first one. Who has access to Cavendish's writings now? If you want access to Cavendish in print, you have a lot of options. Since the 1990s, there's been a steady stream of people transcribing either from EBO editions or from copies of early texts, sometimes modernizing and adding notes, usually writing introduction, and just getting Cavendish into print and making it possible to buy a modern book. If for those not able to afford the print editions, especially some of the more expensive ones, there's also Early English Books Online, which has images of all of her books, although behind a paywall. And then there's also Women Writers Online, which we just heard about, which also has transcriptions of her books instead of images. In front of the paywall, but comparable, are the reading editions on the Digital Cavendish website, which I've just become a co-director of, or my own Poems and Fancies edition, about which I'm going to talk a little bit more later today. So what would Cavendish think of the current state of access to her works, the current possibility for accessing her? Though my primary interest in Cavendish has been and still is in the close interrelationships in her work between literature, science, and philosophy, I've lately been tracking her incredible involvement with her own texts post-print, so after the printer's done with them. So this includes the uniform hand corrections made by her secretary that Jim Fitzmaurice has published about. It includes the paper slips pasted into her plays, which Jeffrey Maston has written about. And it also includes something I have written about, which is what I've called Margaret Cavendish's glitter pen, which is about the glittery blotting sand stuck to the changes that she had made to her 1663 philosophical and physical opinions. Changes, I will note, which she only had made to those copies destined for Oxford. It also means tracking the way that she would collect multiple copies of her printed text and donate them to public and private libraries, here Peterhouse in Cambridge, including the fact that she gave between 6 and 12 copies of her works to every single college in Oxford and in Cambridge that existed during her lifetime. And you can see the wide distribution of her works in the census of surviving books, which I've posted on Digital Cavendish and which I try to keep updated. And in the case of the many books at Oxford and a few other sort of fascinating cases around Europe, many of the books survive in European libraries because she put them there. And here you can see just a visual representation of Cavendish's relationships to her own books post-print. Try not to be intimidated by my Photoshop skills here. A huge number I have found went not from the printer to the bookseller, but went directly to her for alteration and then distribution. And she would also, I have found, do non-uniform corrections. So in addition to the uniform corrections which Jim has published about, she would do non-uniform corrections, making sometimes different changes to text for different audiences. And she also has a few of what I found that I call reading copies, where she's marked up books in her own hand idiosyncratically. A few of those survive. So hence the glitter pen corrections again are found only in Oxford libraries, or in a couple cases in books that used to be in Oxford libraries that have since been relocated. Now, what does all of this do to help us think about access? It helps, I think, because it matters, because it shows the extent to which she took to the extreme the same argument we see playing out often in the content of her works, which is that she thinks very carefully and in detailed ways about audiences, right? So it matters that she's altering her books to look different for different audiences, because she's very concerned to think broadly about the question of audience. She does this in a few ways, one of which is by ensuring her work's distribution, by sending them to friends and frenemies, as well as to sort of institutional libraries. She very carefully managed that distribution, making in many cases different annotations or different marks, using different binding styles, depending on the audience. And we might summarize her relationship to her own printed works and their distribution by saying it's not quantity but quality that matters. She cares about meaningful access to her work, which she attempts to achieve partly by what we might today call targeted marketing. Now, this kind of personalization, adapting different texts to different audiences, that happens at the level of the physical book, which is what I've been doing for the last year or so. Again, her donations of books to specific audiences, and even to some extent the personalizing of books for different audiences. We can also see this logic at play inside the texts themselves. So I've written, for example, in the sort of main introduction to the poems website about the structure of poems and fancies, where each of so it's divided into 5 parts that are very sort of philosophically distinct. These parts are connected by clasps that partake of each of the 2 parts. And each of these 5 parts is targeted very explicitly to a different body of people, to a different audience. Part 1 is intended for natural philosophers, part 2 to moral philosophers. We know this because each part has its own prefatory letters preparing the new audience for the set of poems that are about to follow. Part 3 to poets, part 4 to women and to skeptics, that's my favorite, and then part 5 to soldiers. Although she says multiple times and in multiple different ways that she wants to be famous, that she wants everyone to know her name, right? We know that she wants a wide audience. She also cares about targeted access and targeted audiences. So you will see, and you saw this in 2 Natural Philosophers, that if you're not really prepared to grapple with her atomic philosophy, she invites you to skip over it, right? If you're not the right audience for it, don't read it. You're not ready for it. Again, she cares about access, but she also cares about quality over quantity. So what are we accessing when we read Cavendish's text today? At this point, I would like to tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a scholar, let's call her Schmeiza Schmeik. She was interested in literature and science and literature and philosophy. She had just published an edited collection on atomism, and it came to her attention that she should really check out this Margaret Cavendish fellow. She was revising a book manuscript on early modern literary physics, which is about how literary texts are actively thinking about the nature of nature. And Schmeik, poor young innocent that she was, decided just manuscript about Cavendish's Atom poems. Now, when she went and started looking at the Atom poems, she found that there were 3 editions. She found that when she compared the different editions, there were a huge number of textual changes. Almost every line had a really significant substantive variant. And so she decided that before she could close read these poems, she needed to detail for herself what those changes were in order to figure out which of the versions she should be close reading. And having found no edition that did this work, she got together a couple undergrads and worked through and edited it herself. Now, what she found is, of course, that there are a number of significant changes, but there are also a number of what we might think of as insignificant changes, but they can potentially matter a lot too. So consider the difference, for example, between something so small as a comma. The first one on the top here is 1653, to all noble and worthy ladies, and here you get noble, comma, worthy ladies. In 1664, that becomes noble and worthy ladies, and that change is carried through as well into the 1668 edition. Now, the difference between noble worthy ladies and noble and worthy ladies maybe doesn't seem that significant, but if you think about it, it actually could matter quite a bit, right? If the comma in the 1653 edition is meant to make worthy into a positive redefinition of noble, then the target for this book, because Noble and Worthy Ladies prefaces the whole collection, is women who are noble and who, because they are noble, are worthy, right? Noble, or as another way of saying that, worthy ladies. With the 1664 change, noble and worthy ladies, the audience potentially expands significantly. Now it becomes either women who are noble or women who are worthy, even if they are not noble. So even a tiny change like that between noble, comma, worthy, and noble and worthy potentially sees her reimagining who the audience of these poems are. Now, having done all of this work, I'm now going to reveal to you that this story was about me the whole time. Having done all this work, I then decided that what I needed to put this edition online, not because it's difficult to find access to the text of Margaret Cavendish's poems, but because no one else had done this editorial labor before, and there was no point in making everyone who wanted to close read her poems reproduce this editorial labor. So what I and my students wanted to provide access to, and now I'm just going to jump out and take you to the website itself for a second. What my students and I wanted to provide access to was not the text of the poems, but the work of that editorial labor that we had gone to all the trouble to look up all the changes and note them. And so we wanted other people to be able to access them too. So if you were to go to Noble and Worthy Later Ladies in the prefatory materials, here it is. What matters about this for us is not just, again, that the text of the poems are online, but that all of those textual changes are online. And I'm very proud of myself for installing this widget that lets you mouse over a footnote and it will show you what the change is. And so here you can see Noble and Worthy Ladies is the one we chose. This is a best checked edition. We thought it was the most inclusive, but it is possible for you as the reader to access what that other option was the whole time. And this is really, I think, what the poem adds. Again, not just making the text available, but making that editorial work available. So you can see every single change that she made across editions, and it lets you get a better sense of Cavendish as the editor of herself. So you're not just seeing Cavendish's poetics, you're seeing her, her alterations. And this is why I'm going to jump us just to part 1 and look at one of my favorite poems. It is hard to believe there are other worlds in this world. But I will just say in passing, so anyone who is at last week's session where you had some of the poems in your readings, those were poems from this website sort of lifted and moved into a PDF. If possible, I'd recommend going back and reading these poems on the website itself, because when the footnotes got removed from those poems, you've lost all the different options that she imagined for it. Now I can't find it. It's hard to believe. Here we go. Okay. Let's just look very quickly at It Is Hard to Believe That There Are Other Worlds in This World. A good sentence for a title. Who doesn't love that for their poem? Now, very quickly, I'm sure a lot of you know it already. This is in her World Within World sequence that comes at the end of part 1 of Poems and Fancies. And like the other World Within World poems, it is her insisting that even as she is a natural philosopher, she wants the right to speculate about what nature is and what nature could be beyond the realm of the empirical. So while in World in an Earring, she will say, we can't access this earring world through our senses. We can only sort of imagine what it may be and what it could be. In It Is Hard to Believe There's Other Worlds in This World, she takes a different approach, and her approach in this one is amazing, where she essentially says, if you refuse to believe there might be other worlds within worlds, then you basically aren't allowed to believe in God anymore. Right? She compares her belief in other worlds to everyone else's belief in religion. Nothing so hard in nature as faith is for to believe impossibilities. And that a positive redefinition of faith as believing in impossible things is a bold choice. Perhaps this is why that bold choice got erased in the 2nd and 3rd editions. Nothing doth seem so hard to nature's eyes, she says in 1664 and 1668. And my co-editors and I decided we wanted to keep that first line in because it was really powerful and interesting. And again, if you are close reading this poem, if you want to spend a lot of time thinking through what she's doing in her poetry, knowing both of those options and thinking about both both of those options is just as important as sort of reading the poem itself, I would argue, and I think. And if, for example, you use Brandy Siegfried's edition, which is based on the 1668, you would miss this sort of incredible opening that then gets erased for any possible number of reasons. Now, for those of us who study Renaissance poets, Renaissance authors, especially male authors, there's often centuries of editorial labor to draw on. A lot of this really basic fundamental work, thinking about how different versions of the text relate to one another, has already happened and you can sort of rely on it. This is not the case for Cavendish, because even as we have multiple sort of print instantiations, it's been difficult to sort of collect and figure out where her works are and really access them. But I would argue that moving forward as a field of Cavendish scholars, what we need to access is not just the language of her text, but also the way all the different copies of her text relate to one another. And remember too that she's messing with her books after they come back from the printer, right? So for any early modern text, if you're just looking at one copy, you're not potentially finding stop press changes, right? There's a lot of internal variation that can happen. But for Cavendish's book, if you're only looking at one copy, you maybe haven't found the one that she's marked up and annotated. You haven't found the one that she intended for scholars. You haven't found the one that she intended for friends. There's all this sort of variety among her texts. And what I think a lot of scholars and students need access to is that labor, that textual bibliographical labor, not just the language of one particular copy. And this is, I'm afraid, where EBO lets us down, because EBO by its very nature, I just shared the wrong thing. EBO by its nature chooses only one copy and shows us that one, right? Okay. And I will just also say in passing, as a sort of informal announcement, myself, Jacob Tutalian, and Sean Moore have gotten an invitation to submit a proposal to do the complete works of Cavendish. So hopefully within a few years, some of that information will be more widely accessible. I've talked a very long time, so I'm going to end by just asking very quickly, how can we think not only about access, but about accessibility? And I just want to note in passing that those are two crucially different words. And I'm just going to thank my colleague, Catherine Williams, for giving me some of these sources. Accessibility refers to the means by which people with disabilities can use media, often entailing specialized features or assistive devices. And it's incredibly important, as this article points out about platforming down for disability pedagogy, that although we often think of digital forms as radically accessible, even as they allow access to text, the more elaborate the digital form, the less accessibility it might allow. So if you can't use a screen reader, then it's not accessible to all your disabled students. I will stop talking there, and I look forward to working through all these questions with you.
Welcome back, everybody. Hopefully those were productive and rich. We're curious to hear, especially from the moderators, just kind of a quick summary of what was going on, but also if there are kind of more general, broad-based questions for maybe all three panelists, or questions that bring the different aspects of education and pedagogy and access, and also accessibility, thanks for that distinction, Liza, all into picture. We're really excited to hear about those. So Jim, can I hand the microphone over to you and ask kind of what was going on in the room with Mariah? Jim is
Need to unmute. I'm unmuted. What did we say? We talked about a lot of things. We talked about education. We talked about how Margaret Cavendish herself got educated and her relationship to her husband and the degree to which she learned from him, felt a certain amount of reverence for him. I guess I would say the degree to which the two of them were back and forth, he learned from her. I've always wanted to write an article in which I showed that he was borrowing from her for one of his plays. I haven't been able to do it, but I think it's there.
Do it,
Well,
Jim. Do it.
what do we say, Mariah?
Well, I think that, I mean, one of the interesting things that we revisited or touched upon was the idea of travel as education as well. And so because of her, I mean, it was forced exile, but because Cavendish spent so much time on the continent, it really does sort of reproduce the sort of continental, the grand tour that many upper class, you know, gentlemen experienced. And so that was something that I thought was really interesting. And of course, we talked about the distinctions between the artificial and the natural learning, right? So education is artificial and wit is natural. And also the degree to which Cavendish was performing her modesty, right? So the modesty topos that comes in many of the paratextual materials and prefaces, but also just the way that she, you know, presents herself or performs herself as this bashful person, even though she was very much performing. It was a very helpful discussion for me anyway.
We were having a reflection just on how to generate within students a kind of a sense of comfort, not necessarily of access to the digital world. And that was kind of the heart of our conversation over in the panel, but something that ties to what E and Jim were talking about just a moment ago is, I mean, I know this is going to sound completely remarkable, but maybe as recently as maybe 20 or 30 years ago, the idea of a female programmer and coder might have seemed very, very strange. And we have an example of Sarah Connell, somebody who has clearly made a point to say that coding and programming is not a sort of male-dominated territory, and who now is particularly interested in the fact that writing books was an extremely male-dominated territory in Cavendish's time, but now we can actually retrieve the ways in which women not necessarily just kind of entered the male territory and adopted those modes, but actually did something entirely different from the get-go. And so we were fascinated by, and Sarah, I want you to jump in and share these examples again, but maybe just of like Cavendish's little idiosyncrasies. And maybe also just to kind of highlight this vector network thing that was coming up and that's blowing all of our minds that were in that small group.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the challenges of teaching students who work for the Women Writers Project how to consistently encode all of these very different documents and how we think about the particularities of those documents and kind of encourage our students to get very invested in really truly understanding what's going on in those documents. And that led us to thinking about, you know, this age-old question of, is Cavendish distinctive? Is she eccentric? Is she an outlier? And so we talked about some of the ways that that distinctiveness can be kind of investigated with the markup. And some of the things that are measurably distinct about Cavendish, including her gender parity in her dramas. So we can measure how many words women speak, how many turns they take. And by contrast with the rest of the WWO collection, Cavendish's women are, you know, equal page space to men, or sometimes even more. And she's also distinctive in other really interesting ways, like the only preface that appears in the back matter for any text in the whole of Women Writers Online is a Cavendish preface. The only time we have a title inside of a stage direction is a Cavendish title. So she's a big presence in the collection because we have 1 million words of Cavendish out of 12 million total words. But even despite her sheer volume, she's also distinctive just in ways that are kind of baked into the markup. And that sort of led us to the Women Writers Vector Toolkit, which I have to, this is linked from the WWP Lab slide that I showed, but unfortunately right now they're resetting the server. So if you went now, it would be down. But normally it will let you look at words kind of across the collection computationally to see which are most similar or most likely to appear in the same contexts. And so there was one that I put in, I think I put in the term bod. And one of the terms that came back was devirginated. And I was like, who says the word devirginated in Women Writers Online? And of course it was Cavendish. We also had the unexpected result of one of the closest words to mermaids was beetles. And that is because of our lyric poetry, because the things you hear in lyric poems are things like mermaids and beetles. So yeah, that's just a fun tool to play with. There actually are enough Cavendish words that you could develop a model just on Cavendish, which now I'm kind of inspired to go forth and do, but I've never tried before.
Sophie, Liza, would you give us a kind of quick summary of what was going on in the room with you all?
Sure, we were focusing on editing kind of then and now. So we talked a little bit about how she jumped a lot between editors, and it seemed to take a while till she kind of found one she was happy with. And we were also talking about how much we should privilege authorial intent insofar as we can reconstruct it, and how much we should think of it as a genuine collaboration with a printer who may have made these either significant or insignificant changes to things like punctuation and spelling and so forth. And then we were talking about editing today, editing with students, and kind of how to get them involved and ideally not intimidated, and sharing some success stories. Yeah, who in my group wants to jump in? Anyone? Liza, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, I thought we did both sort of the Cavendish's people who acted on Cavendish's text in the past, and then also how we might get our students to produce editions. And I thought in the first section of the discussion, Martine brought up a really interesting point, which is, you know, normally if you're looking at something like a comma and a prefatory note, this isn't something that you would necessarily consider interesting or authorial, right? And so if what matters is a comma being added or removed, we would assume that that is something a compositor would choose, and therefore would we give it credit. And we talked a little bit about how modern editorial theory is doing a lot to think about networked intention. So not just the author, but also editors and editors, printers, compositors, husbands who are reading and offer commentary, right? Sort of distributed modes of authorship, and how do we edit for those different distributed modes of authorship? I think that about covers it.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add in terms of what our group talked about, because I think that Sophie and Liza did a good job of summarizing it. But I do have a question for everyone, and maybe especially for Sarah and Liza, because the question is about their papers. But I was wondering, you know, if we're thinking about teaching editing alongside Cavendish, or teaching encoding alongside Cavendish, what are the affordances of having students edit texts without TEI encoding versus teaching students to do TEI? Like, if you teach a kind of editing and coding assignment that includes TEI, does that allow students to do something different than editing without it does? Or are they both just different ways of thinking about close reading and analysis on a different level?
I guess I can jump in with that, because I also do teach a editing project for a Shakespeare edition that one of our faculty members is developing, the Cacodemon Shakespeare project, in case anyone's curious about checking it out. And that one, the students just use WordPress. So they still do annotations, they still have to make decisions about display of the text. They still have to sort of come up with kind of some interpretive analysis and layer that in, but they do it directly in WordPress by, you know, kind of using the various formatting buttons, and then I think we might even be using the same annotation plugin, actually, Liza. And I think the main difference is that the TEI just demands so much more precision and specificity. So because you are wrestling with all different kinds of textual phenomena in things that would be unpractical to mark out explicitly in a regular WordPress edition, you know, you're not going to put name around every single name in a WordPress document. That just doesn't make sense. So I think that is one of the bigger differences, is that you can have students do a lot of the same kind of editorial choices, contextualization, and so on and so forth, but they don't get quite as sort of intimate or grounded or demanding kind of an exposure to their own editorial theories. So in many cases, it depends on how much you want to foreground the editing activity overall versus how much getting, and I think also there's a little bit more of that I learned something that I thought would be scary, and in fact, it actually has turned out to be kind of empowering and interesting. You can get that a little bit more with the TEI, and then you can do that post-editing analysis much more. You can have the students go and look through their own corpus and say, we built this, and now we can analyze it. And with a WordPress-based corpus, you can sort of do a visual comparison between the different texts, but you can't do the same, find me all of this kind of language and look at it together. But I'd be super interested to hear what Liza has to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I do have for the Choose Your Own Adventures thing that's called that until I get sued. I do have an XML file for that one. But for the WordPress site, if you look at the back end of it, it's just, oh, now I have to log in again. It's just HTML. Never mind, I can't show you, it turns out. It's just HTML markup, right? And so if you're marking it up in HTML, you're not marking up meaningful parts of the text. All the markup has to do with display, right? When it goes in, I want this to be bolded. When it goes in, I want you to add a footnote here, right? And so it's not actually at all useful for doing large scale analysis in the way that putting everything in XML does, which is just a version of what Sarah said. Especially when you have versions, like I once had a 2-hour editing meeting with my undergrads about whether to use in or of in one of the fairy poems, right? So you can get really deep into it, especially if you have them read. Jonathan Crannick has this beautiful textbook for editing in the undergrad classroom, and the introduction to that makes them convinced that every space is meaningful, and then they get really wrapped up in it. So there are different ways, like the useful things about editing and encoding, they have sort of these practical, pragmatic outputs, right? When my class made an anthology, I can like teach the anthology next time. But it also, the process of editing gets them to engage really closely with the text in a slightly different way than if they were writing a paper, but in a comparable way, right? You never know a text so well as when you're editing it, and that goes for undergrads as well as scholars and editors.
Gweno, do you want to go ahead and share?
Sorry. Can I just say, I think it's fantastic to hear about these editing projects, because what they're doing is they're giving the students agency, but they're also giving them a future, because they're saying, here's a model for academic work. Here's a model for a kind of job that you might have in the future within a university, which would not necessarily be the kind of teaching, researching, admin model that used to apply. And the point about gender that Arno made, I think, is really important. So I'm absolutely inspired by this. And I know that many of us have done the anthologizing of early modern texts, because that was the way to get the texts and to get the texts all together. But I think you guys are taking it a stage further, because you're actually getting the students to do discovery learning, to do discovery research, but also to learn a set of skills that are really important and very practical. And in the UK, we always have to show how we're related to future employment. What employment skills are we giving? What are our students learning at all levels that relate to employment as well as to knowledge? And you're doing that brilliantly. So I'm inspired to hear about this.
Yeah, the province of Ontario is really into experiential learning. And so it also makes it really easy to get internal teaching grants. Because I'm like, they're experiencing learning. It's magic. And then you can just make them close read the whole time. You really put one over on the province.
I was just thinking the same thing, because Northeastern is an experiential education school. And it's like, we have these experiential classes, and you're like, but secretly we're learning close reading. It's the same thing.
Cavendish would probably approve of that, given her focus on experience as something that's important for learning. One of the questions that Marina sort of broached when we started our discussion was really like, how do these three panels connect to one another? And so, or not three panels, but three panelists and three presentations. And I definitely I definitely sold this to Sarah and Liza as like, I am gonna set this up and then hand it over to you to focus on these amazing projects that you're doing. Because I do think it's really important to talk about access to the early modern women. And I loved, Liza, the way that you sort of started out your paper with the idea of how accessible is Cavendish as an individual. And that was sort of one of the reasons why in our readings, we began with the preface from the World's Olio that identifies the World's Olio as her earliest writing, or the earliest published writing. And I can just like feel, I can see her as this like young woman taking these pieces of paper and locking them in a trunk. And I think that and then going off, you know, to England and forgetting about them for years. So I don't know how, if anyone has some brilliant ways to sort of connect these three very disparate presentations. But I just wanted to say the projects and the people that are working on making these women writers more accessible, and that includes with the Perdita project and the Hester Poulter project. I just think that these are such important things that we are doing. And I think that it is going to change and is changing sort of the map in terms of the English literary canon and also the way that we're teaching. So I just want to thank my panelists. And also if anyone has ideas or ways that they've connected these sort of different projects in their own minds, I would love to hear some general responses from that as well. Or any questions that people have.
I mean, one thing that I thought connected all three of our papers really nicely was both the sort of study of Cavendish herself, I almost said, but Cavendish herself with linking of sort of modern pragmatical things we can do with it, right? So I'm going to think about education, but I'm also going to think about what it means to bring Cavendish into modern classrooms, right? I can think about the processes of editing with students, but I also want to bring that back to like what it would have meant to Cavendish to think about having access to her works and who gets access. And Sarah thinking about this is not just a sort of thing that gets grant money from places that care about the word experiential. It's also a better way of sort of reading and figuring out what's happening with Cavendish herself, right? So I think all of us were thinking about sort of tools and practical applications, but not dropping those onto Cavendish from afar, but sort of drawing them out of the way her works are written and the things that are actually important to her, right?
Can I jump in with a question real quick? I was curious to turn to that sort of second category of accessibility. I'm really interested with people who have been using these sort of online platforms, like how, can you do it with a screen reader? Like what experiences, what impediments have you had? Has anything interesting happened? Or have there been sort of small enough sample sizes that hasn't really come up yet?
I mean, for women writers online, because we're a collection that people pay money for, some people, we have to know our own accessibility. It's just like something that the institutions who subscribe to us require. And so we know like the exact point on the accessibility rating for the standardized system. And we do pretty well, but the reason we're able to do pretty well is actually connected to a point Liza raised, which is the fact that there's not a lot of complicated technological bells and whistles on the WWO site. And so basically everything is accessible from a screen reader because it's just text. We don't have to do alt text because we don't have any images at all. And so I think that as we start to build up more complicated functionality in the platform, that's something that we're going to have to be very aware of. And there are projects who are doing some really marvelous work in that direction that are really inspirational. And there's a field called minimal computing, which if folks are interested in accessibility is worth checking out. People who are making publication platforms that are explicitly designed to be accessible, not just from a disability perspective, but also from sort of thinking about kind of the computational power. You know, there are many places in the world where the only computer anyone has is a cell phone. So that's just a very huge and important field. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the advantages of using WordPress is that it thinks about that. Like it shows you what it will look like on a phone, what it will look like on a laptop, right? You can see all the different possible modes of access, and also the footnotes are a little bit more complicated, but it does work with a screen reader. The sort of example that happened to me this semester that I never think about until you need to, right, is for my graduate class, I uploaded a PDF of an article, which you do all the time, right? I scanned it and uploaded it from a book. And one of my students said, you know, I use a screen reader and I can't use this because the text can't be recognized. And if you do 2 pages as a spread, the screen reader, even if you do text recognition, will try and read across, which is like beautiful found poetry, but not useful for reading articles. And so just even scanning one at a time and having the right kind of Adobe to make the text recognizable was what was necessary to make that article sort of accessible to that student. And so, yeah, the simpler you can keep it, the better, right? If you're having to click through Flash things and find buttons that are a picture of a sun to keyword search sun, then not everyone's going to be able to use that, even if it's really cute.
Martine, did you want to jump in? You had your hand up a little moment ago.
I did, and you know, it's kind of a different direction, so it's not as technical, I guess. But I was just wondering if E had experience teaching these educational texts, because it seems such a lovely selection for students to think about their own learning styles, or about accessibility, about what you're told is useful to learn, those kinds of things. I was just wondering if she's, you know, done that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I am still in the process of teaching general education literature students. So what I have taught has been a few of her prefaces, and then I actually use Liza's website to teach some of the various poems. So I introduce Cavendish and I give some of, like I said, some of these prefaces and talk about how she's developing this authorial persona. And students find it to be very, I mean, this is why I love how Liza started her paper with the accessibility, because students relate to Cavendish, they get her, right? And so one of the things that I like to begin with is, you know, some of the different passages where Cavendish says, I never went to school, I barely knew how to read, you know, and they begin to relate with her, especially when we're talking about non-English majors who are suddenly being asked to read 17th century literature. And so they do find this person to be a very compelling historical figure. And so one of the reasons that I was so like, when Arno suggested the Olio series, I was like, I want in on this and I want to talk about education and access, because everyone that I introduce Cavendish to says, why haven't I heard of this person sooner? And so, you know, the projects that we're all working on and the things that we're doing, I think are timely and important. But I haven't yet had a chance to really dig in and teach students about Cavendish as a pedagogue, though when I use her sort of approaches, I will point out to them, I am now going to do something that Cavendish did or Cavendish suggested, and that they always appreciate having that kind of insight. So yeah, I hope that answered. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're about to wrap up. I want to give the floor next to David, who had his hand up, but I also want to make sure any folks who might have last questions, anybody who's maybe been quieter than it might have liked, just go ahead and send me a chat or let me know that you want to speak. You have a question you want to get out there. But otherwise, David, jump in.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah, I'm in the car, so I have my video off. But I wanted to ask, I thought that the presentations were so helpful. And one common theme, it seemed to me, was agency in terms of, you know, who is an agent and who has the authority to seek and acquire an education, how we maybe trip over ourselves sometimes in the course of trying to obtain agency. But also the question, this goes, I think, to some of Liza's discussion, the question almost of the agency of the books themselves, right? That Cavendish made such efforts to make sure that these got placed in libraries maybe wonder if she ever put any of them in a time capsule, you know, so that they'd be found in future generations. Because she does talk about how am I still, am I muted? Or, okay, she talks about how in a different time, you know, maybe people will be differently receptive to her work in the future, and how she would love to have fame, whether she's alive to experience it or not. These books they've come to have a kind of agency now, because she made sure that they were there for us to read. That's all, thanks.
Liza has a bit of a snarky take on Liza, please jump in.
Snarky? I was nothing but sincere. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work recently on Cavendish, on the bindings of Cavendish's books, because she had them batch bound before she gave them out, I have discovered. And she has like cheapo bindings and then upscale bindings, and the technical term for them is extra. A lot of her bindings are extra, sort of a nice coming together of Instagram vocabulary there. And who got the extra bindings and who got the menial bindings is really interesting. But yeah, so many of those bindings survive because, as far as I can tell, she dropped them off in the library and they filed them away, and like maybe they moved them around a couple of times, but no one was really using them. So unlike Shakespeare, where all the bindings have crumbled away because people have been licking him for centuries or whatever, you know, fondling his books and opening them in naughty ways. She just survived, right? She survived to us, and now we can work with her books and learn all sorts of stuff about them.
Gweno, please come through.
Just to say, she also knowingly distributed much more widely than any other woman writer. She, you know, they borrowed money to publish. She didn't care how much they borrowed. That was kind of William's problem, as it were. And then she distributed in a very ambitious way. And whereas with some women writers, you know, certainly with plays from the period, we're somebody like Lady Jane Lumley, you know, we're dealing with a single precious manuscript or a manuscript and a bit. And with Cavendish, you just haven't got that problem, because she kind of provided, not with a deliberate time capsule, though I think David's absolutely right about writing for posterity or being aware of posterity, but she scattered the books widely enough that they would be sure to continue to exist. You know, even if we'd lost a quarter of them, even if we'd lost half of them, we'd still have loads to work on. So I think that she was in a way astute and knowing, or astute and optimistic in a way that's very, very useful to us now.
David, your hand is still up. Did you still want to come through and respond, or is that just the driving? I'm going to presume the hand is just up. Okay. Dear friends, dear Cavendishians, this is a wrap. Thank you to all of you who came out for this complete experiment to talk about experiential learning. We just want to pull up a quick slide to acknowledge a few people that we really need to thank. In particular, would not have been possible without all of you. But we also especially wanted to thank Diana Applebaum, who was one of our very first you know, go-getting panel participants back when, in the days when we were talking about insects, it feels like ages ago, but who also really helped come up with the format in a lot of ways. I wanted to thank Delilah Bermudez-Bratas, our lovely web editor for the Cavendish Society, who's been doing fantastic work for us, and Sean Moore, who knows it but hasn't said it, and who's going to help us disseminate the Olio webinars through recordings, which hopefully you will see very, very soon, although of course we are trying to be sensitive about that material, and we're going to try to make some good decisions. So do keep us in mind as this feedback form, which you can see in the chat linked through Sophia's chat. Do take 5 minutes, maybe tomorrow morning or tonight if you still have time, to give us some feedback. Let us know very kind of earnestly and critically what worked, what didn't, and also let us know if you'd like to be part of the next series in the spring. We're looking for folks to hand this on to, and we're looking for the bright minds that you are to lead us into the spring, when hopefully things will just be better. It's always silly to be optimistic. Voltaire taught me that back in grade school, but I'm going to go for it because this is the pits. But this has been a bright, bright light, and so we're just so delighted. I hope it's brought smiles to all of you, and that you go into the weekend joyfully singing alongside Cavendish